The man who had turned sarcasm into an art form looked like he was afraid to stop talking. Ryan Reynolds sat across from Jimmy Fallon in Studio 6B, his trademark wit firing on all cylinders. But something underneath the rapid-fire jokes seemed desperate, almost manic. The actor who had built a career on never taking anything seriously now appeared to be using humor like a shield against something much more serious. Jimmy noticed it immediately. They'd been playing authentic moments, a Tonight Show game where celebrities were supposed to share genuine, unfiltered thoughts about their lives. For most guests, it was a chance to drop their guard and connect. For Ryan, it had become a comedy marathon that was starting to feel less like entertainment and more like avoidance. "All right, Ryan, here's a deep one," Jimmy had said with his usual warmth. "Tell us about a moment when you felt most like yourself. Not the character, not the persona, just Ryan." The question should have been straightforward, a chance for some honest self-reflection from one of Hollywood's most beloved personalities. Instead, Jimmy watched as Ryan's comedy engine shifted into overdrive. "Well, that's assuming there is a just Ryan under all this devastating good looks and Canadian politeness," Ryan quipped, gesturing to himself. "I mean, take away the wit, the charm, the inexplicable ability to make Deadpool work, and you're basically left with a very anxious maple syrup enthusiast." The audience laughed, as they always did with Ryan, but Jimmy caught something in the joke that felt different. The usual confidence wasn't there. This felt more like deflection than humor. "Ryan," Jimmy said gently, "I'm serious. When was the last time you felt like you could just be completely yourself?" "Define myself," Ryan shot back immediately. "Because I've been performing so long, I'm not entirely sure where the performance ends and whatever sad reality begins. It's like asking a clown when they felt most clownish. The makeup is pretty much permanent at this point." Another laugh from the audience, but Jimmy could see something flickering behind Ryan's eyes that looked suspiciously like panic. "Can you try answering without making a joke?" Jimmy asked. The request hung in the studio air like a challenge Ryan wasn't sure he could meet. For the first time in the interview, he went completely silent. Not the dramatic pause of a practiced performer, but the desperate silence of someone who genuinely didn't know how to proceed. Ryan started, then stopped. His hands, usually animated and gesturing, clasped together tightly. "Jimmy, I don't think I know how to do that anymore." The confession was so quiet it almost got lost, but Jimmy caught the shift. This wasn't the confident Ryan Reynolds anymore. This was something more vulnerable. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked, his entertainment instincts giving way to genuine concern. Ryan looked down at his hands, then back up at Jimmy, and for the first time in the interview, his face was completely serious. "I mean, I've been making jokes for so long that I've forgotten how to have a regular conversation, how to just exist without entertaining someone." The studio fell silent. The audience, expecting more rapid-fire wit, instead found themselves witnessing something unexpected. Their favorite comedian admitting he might not know how to stop being one. Jimmy made a decision that would define this moment. He stood up from his desk and moved to sit directly next to Ryan, sensing that this conversation needed presence, not performance. "Ryan, talk to me about that," Jimmy said gently. "It started as a survival mechanism," Ryan said, his voice smaller than anyone had ever heard it. "Growing up, if I could make people laugh, they wouldn't focus on how weird I felt inside. If I was funny enough, maybe they wouldn't notice that I was basically terrified of everything." The cameras continued rolling, but everyone in Studio 6B understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. One of comedy's quickest wits revealing the anxiety that fueled his humor. "What were you terrified of?" Jimmy asked. "Everything," Ryan said simply. "Social situations, quiet moments, people getting too close and seeing that I was just ordinary, disappointing, not as interesting as the jokes made me seem." He ran his hand through his hair nervously. So I learned that if I could control the conversation with humor, I could control how people saw me. If I was always the funny guy, I never had to risk being the boring guy or the anxious guy or the guy who didn't have anything interesting to say. Jimmy leaned closer. But what happens when you're alone? When there's no one to entertain? That's when it gets bad, Ryan admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Because the voice in my head that's usually making jokes for other people starts making jokes about me. And they're not kind jokes, Jimmy. They're the kind of jokes that make you question everything about yourself. The audience was completely silent, many beginning to understand how the thing that made Ryan so beloved could also be the thing that tormented him. I'll lie in bed at night and my brain will start doing crowd work on my own insecurities, Ryan continued. It's like having a really cruel comedian living in your head who knows all your weak spots and won't stop performing. Jimmy felt his heart break for the man sitting next to him. Ryan, do you ever get panic attacks? Constantly, Ryan said without hesitation. And you know what the weird part is? Even during a panic attack, I'll try to make jokes about having a panic attack. Like I'll be hyperventilating and thinking, this would be great material if I could just breathe properly. He looked out at the audience. I've never told anyone this, but I once had a panic attack during a movie premiere. Full red carpet, cameras everywhere, and I'm dying inside. So what did I do? I started making jokes about how uncomfortable the suit was, how terrible the movie probably was, anything to deflect from the fact that I felt like I was having a heart attack in front of 500 people. Jimmy was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Ryan was sharing. What would happen if you just stopped? If you went a whole day without making jokes? Ryan looked genuinely terrified by the suggestion. I can't, he said immediately. Because what if people realize that without the humor, I'm just nothing? What if the real me is actually as boring as I'm afraid he is? But Ryan, Jimmy said carefully, what if the real you is actually more interesting than any joke you could make? What if people don't love you because you're funny? What if they love you and the humor is just a bonus? For the first time in the conversation, Ryan's eyes showed a flicker of hope mixed with disbelief. I don't know how to test that theory without risking everything. What do you mean? I mean my entire career, my marriage, my friendships. They're all built on this version of me that's always on. What if I turn off the jokes and everyone realizes they preferred the performance? Jimmy reached over and placed a supportive hand on Ryan's shoulder. Can I tell you something? In the last 5 minutes, you've been more real, more vulnerable, more genuinely interesting than in any interview I've ever seen you do. And I don't think anyone in this audience is thinking, gee, I wish he'd make more jokes right now. Jimmy turned to address the audience. How many people in here feel more connected to Ryan right now than you did when he was doing comedy? Hands shot up throughout the studio. Not just a few, but nearly everyone. Jimmy turned back to Ryan. You see that? They're not here because they need entertainment. They're here because they recognize something real in you. Ryan looked out at all those raised hands, and something in his expression began to shift. The terror was still there, but it was being joined by something else. Possibility. I want to try something, Ryan said, addressing the audience directly. I want to tell you something true about myself without making a joke about it. The studio fell completely silent, everyone understanding they were about to witness something unprecedented. I love my wife and kids more than anything in the world, Ryan said, his voice steady and serious. And my biggest fear isn't that my career will end or that I'll run out of material. My biggest fear is that they'll get tired of the performance and realize they don't actually know who I am underneath it all. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I've been so afraid of being boring that I forgot being real might be more valuable than being entertaining. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't comedy applause. It was recognition, appreciation for someone showing up authentically. How does that feel? Jimmy asked. Terrifying, Ryan said honestly, but also lighter, like I just put down something heavy I'd been carrying for a really long time. Jimmy stood up and embraced Ryan, not a show business hug, but a real moment of human connection. When they separated, he looked directly at his guest. Ryan, thank you for showing us that sometimes the bravest thing a comedian can do is stop being funny long enough to be human. Thank you for making it safe to not have a punchline ready, Ryan replied. 6 months later, Ryan Reynolds began incorporating more serious, unguarded moments into his interviews and social media presence. He also started therapy specifically focused on anxiety management and learning to be comfortable with silence and genuine connection. The Tonight Show segment became one of the most viewed and shared pieces of content about comedy, anxiety, and authenticity ever created. Mental health organizations credited Ryan with helping people understand how humor could become both a coping mechanism and a prison. Jimmy said in later interviews that the conversation changed how he approached comedy and vulnerability. Ryan taught me that the goal isn't to always be funny. The goal is to always be real. And sometimes real is funnier than any joke you could write. And Ryan? He continued being one of Hollywood's funniest actors, but now his humor came from a place of choice rather than compulsion. He learned that people didn't love him because he was always entertaining. They loved him because he was brave enough to occasionally stop entertaining and just be himself. The man who had used sarcasm as armor had finally learned that sometimes the best defense was having the courage to be defenseless. And in those moments of vulnerability, he discovered something more valuable than any punchline: the relief of being genuinely known and accepted.